It's great to join you here this evening. I'm really proud to support Brighton Secular Humanists and indeed the wider secular humanist and atheist movement. The title of tonight's talk is My Journey from Christianity to Humanism. And it's really sharing with you some of my own personal experiences of how I changed from what I was brought up to be and believe to what I am now and what I believe today. For me, it was a journey from religious dogma to an understanding based on science, rationalism, and human understanding. And it's a journey that many people have done in many different ways, but this is my personal story. So my starting point is that even now I will acknowledge there are many wonderful, good people of faith. You think of people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Archbishop Oscar Romero, and many others. These are people whose faith has led them to do quite extraordinary, amazing, wonderful things for humankind. Some might say it's despite their faith, but I don't care. To me, what matters is results. Wherever someone is coming from is less important than what they actually say and do. And I think that those individuals that I mentioned have all made extraordinary contributions to human progress and endeavour. But having said that, I would also say that organised religion, that is, religious authorities, the power structures of religion worldwide, are almost certainly the greatest exponents of obscurantism, prejudice, superstition, and oppression. They have caused misery to billions of people for millennia, including condoning slavery, colonialism, the Inquisition, the denial of votes to women, and mass homophobic persecution worldwide. That is the true and overriding legacy of organised religion, notwithstanding the fact that there are some people of faith who have done good things and whose efforts and endeavours we should applaud. So how come, given religion's rather bloody, oppressive history, have I ended up to be so different, given that I was brought up in that tradition and I knew no other as a child? How come that I was once enthralled to this systemic, organised religion? And nowadays, as you know, I am, or try to be, a human rights activist, inspired and motivated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not a religious dogma, but a man-made document drawn together by people of many different beliefs and cultures. And I do evidence-based campaigning, rooted in humanitarian and rational values, not divine dogmas. But once, a long time ago, I had a very different perspective. Indeed, I grew up in a very devout, evangelical Christian family in Melbourne, Australia, in the 1950s and 60s. And when I say devout, evangelical Christian family, I'm talking about Pentecostal, born again, religious fundamentalist. In many ways, they were very nice people, but they had very, very fixed dogmatic and fundamentalist ideas. My mother and stepfather, my parents were divorced when I was 4, I spent most of my childhood with my stepfather, were very prim and proper working class parents. Small C conservative, with Christian-inspired views on everything. Their views on any subject under the sun was totally and utterly regulated by what is the Christian perspective, as they saw it. They were very, very, very strict. I remember once saying gee whiz, and I got bashed by my mother, who said it was blasphemy because gee whiz was short for Jesus. I never knew that. Within our family, my stepfather was the patriarch, the authority figure, who required absolute obedience for his wife and his children. This is all based upon an interpretation of biblical narrative and a dogma. We children had to obey without question. If we answered back or responded to any command, we were beaten. And this was done in the name of the Christian duty of a father to give a punishment to his child. The Bible, every single word of it was deemed to be the literal word of God. And this brand of Christianity was totally devoid of any social conscience dimension. There was no understanding, acknowledgement, or let alone embrace of a social duty. Everything revolved around the family and the church. My parents had virtually no friends outside of the immediate family, who were also the same similar God-fearing Christians, and church people with whom they mixed on a Sunday. They were very much Old Testament rather than New. Very literalist and fundamentalist rather than any modern understanding of Christianity as some faith leaders have espoused. Our Christianity was all about personal salvation, the fear of divine punishment for sin. The God we were taught about, when I say we, my brother and two sisters, the God we were taught about was a very harsh, strict, unforgiving God, a God of punishment. According to our church, some of the worst sins were swearing, drinking alcohol, smoking, dancing, sex outside of marriage, communism, belief in evolution, not praying, and failing to go to church every Sunday. These were the really big sins. We were never taught that hatred or prejudice, that misogyny or homophobia was a sin. We were never taught that slavery or colonialism were wrong. It was all about these very direct personal things. I remember my stepfather threatened to beat me if I ever talked about evolution. And all of my extended family were of the same harsh persuasion. So naturally, not knowing anything different, I embraced that understanding of religion as well. I had no alternative reference point. What my family taught me, what my parents taught me, was all I knew. Some of you may have seen the film or read the book, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Janet Winterson. Well, that's a pretty close approximation of my family. Pretty close. Nevertheless, at around the age of 13 at secondary school, I did begin to think for myself, being exposed to history, science, physics, the rest of it. I can remember we had a rather smug religious education teacher who one day gave us a lesson in faith. And he said, this is what faith is. He said that when you go to switch on a light, you don't think about it. You have faith that the room will light up. And he suggested that faith in God was similar to faith in the power of electricity to turn on a light. Bad analogy, I thought. What causes a light to go on when we fix the switch is not faith, it's man-made electricity and wiring. And this can be demonstrated by empirical evidence. The existence of God cannot. So this set my mind thinking rather skeptical, heretical thoughts. I came to a very similar conclusion in my own way as that of Epicurus millennia earlier. Only he expressed it much better than my 13-year-old mind. And for those of you who don't recall, this is what Epicurus wrote. If God is willing to prevent evil, but is not able to, then he is not omnipotent. If he is able to prevent evil, but not willing to do so, then he is malevolent. If he is both able and willing, whence cometh evil? If he is neither able or willing, then why call him God? So that was the way, in a much less eloquently formulated way, that my mind began to go. This nascent questioning was not, however, strong enough to stop me, at the age of 16, becoming a Sunday school teacher to 6-year-olds. Being of an artistic persuasion, I made very colourful cardboard tableaus of biblical stories. The children loved it. I was one of the most, or probably the most popular Sunday school teacher in the church. The kids would always turn up to my classes. They'd hate to miss my stories and my little graphic illustrations with cardboard cutout figures. I suppose one of the first really serious cracks in my faith began to appear the previous year, when I was 15, in 1967, when an escaped convict, Ronald Ryan, was hanged for a murder almost certainly that he did not commit. At the age of 15, based on a newspaper report on the autopsy on the dead warder's body, I worked out the trajectory of the bullet through the body meant that it was almost impossible for Ronald Ryan to have fired the fatal shot from where he was standing and where the warder was standing when he was killed. Despite the contrary evidence, Ryan was executed anyway. The state government in Victoria was pursuing a strongly law and order campaign with an election coming up, and they blithely dismissed not only the evidence, the contradictory, the awkward evidence about the bullet's trajectory, but also even testimony from a warder in the prison who said that he thought the warder was accidentally shot by another warder when he stepped into the line of fire while the warder was trying to shoot Ryan. And that would fit with the trajectory of the bullet through the dead warder's body. That not only shattered my confidence in the police, courts and government, that they could allow a man to hang when there was at least a reasonable doubt about his guilt. But it got me also thinking about my faith. According to St. Paul in the Bible, Romans 13, verses 1 to 2, all governments are ordained by God. To oppose them is to oppose God. But why would God, I asked myself, ordain a government that allowed an apparent injustice such as Ronald Ryan's execution? And if God did ordain that government, did that God deserve respect? And what about other excesses by tyrannical governments? Did God really ordain the Nazi regime, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, South Africa apartheid? And closer to home, I began to ask about the 19th century British colonial administration in Australia, which decimated, either by intention or neglect, the Aboriginal peoples of that country, the first Australians. It's estimated that when the first British settlers arrived in 1788, there were up to 750,000 indigenous Aboriginal peoples. By the early 20th century, the number of full-blood Aboriginals left alive was down to about 120,000. That's a genocide. Any way you read it, any way you write it, that's a genocide. And then, of course, I realized that this genocide was aided and abetted by Christian missionaries. Christian missionaries went arm in arm with the colonizers to demand the Aboriginal people give up their own belief system and embrace Christianity. That they were pagans, heathens, who had to be converted. And the combination of Christian missionaries and colonial administration decimated and broke up traditional Aboriginal tribal culture, dividing families. And right up until the mid-20th century, Aboriginal kids were stolen from their parents in order to civilize them, often with the connivance of Christian churches. I thought to myself, this is so wrong. This is so wrong. How would I feel it, if I had a loving family and I was taken away from that family and given to another family hundreds or thousands of miles away? Taken away from my brother and sisters. I wouldn't like it, so I'm sure Aboriginal kids didn't like it either. And what kind of Christianity is it that does that to families and children? This was profoundly shocking to me. So I began very tentatively to develop my own version of what's now called liberation theology, long before I ever heard the phrase. I didn't immediately break with Christianity, but I evolved a new interpretation understanding which was based upon the Sermon on the Mount. The idea that we should each be our brother and sister's keeper, that we should be good Samaritans and not walk by on the other side of the road when someone is suffering. I adapted or took those elements of Christianity and sought to think that these ought to be the tenets, the principles by which true Christians live, and saw that as a way of human liberation. As I said, I had never heard of the phrase liberation theology. I never used it myself, but that was the sort of concept that evolved in my mind around the age of 15 or 16. During the 1960s, when I was growing up as a teenager, the nightly TV news and newspapers were dominated by a reportage of the US Black Civil Rights Movement. I was profoundly affected by the white supremacist massacre of 4 young girls in a church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. They threw a bomb into the church and killed 4 young girls about my own age. I thought to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? As you know, the Black Civil Rights Movement was led by a Baptist pastor, Martin Luther King Jr. To me, he was doing what Christianity ought to be. It wasn't just pious words and personal salvation. It was about putting those ideals in the Gospels into practice, making them a force for social justice here on earth. So I concluded that this is what Christianity should be about. So at the age of 14, I left my parents' Pentecostal church and started going to the local Baptist church instead. Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister. I thought, well, the Baptists have got to be better than the Pentecostals. Alas, I was very disappointed. It wasn't what I'd come to expect at all. Not even a quarter as radical as Martin Luther King's Baptist social conscience. But undeterred, I continued to evolve my own idea of what I call revolutionary Christianity. My motto was Jesus Christ, the Liberator. As I said, based on the ideas in the Sermon on the Mount and the parable of the Good Samaritan. It led me to try and translate those religious ideas with which I've been brought up into an effective and practical form of social conscience and social action. So that very quickly led me into Christian-inspired activism for Aboriginal rights, as well as against the death penalty, apartheid, the draft, and Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. I linked up with members of the student Christian movement, who are some of the most radical and inspiring people in Australia in that era. They were faith-based, faith-motivated, but they were real heroes. They did civil disobedience against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, civil disobedience against the denial of rights to Aboriginal people. Some of them went to prison. This was what Christianity should be about. So I was very attracted to and linked up with them and got involved in them. At the same time, I was also a great admirer of the US direct action Catholic anti-war protesters, Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan. I don't know if any of you know who they were, but they were two Catholic priests in America who believed that the war in Vietnam was immoral and that it was a Christian duty to do everything to frustrate and sabotage that war. So they were involved in breaking into draft offices and burning records. They openly encouraged young men to refuse the draft and risked imprisonment for sedition and incitement. They were doing what I thought all Christians should do. And for those who don't know about the history of the Vietnam War, we went there ostensibly to save the people of South Vietnam from communism. But in the process, we committed crimes at least as bad as what any of the communists ever did, if not worse. The mass carpet bombing of Cambodia, Laos, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed, the deliberate, indiscriminate targeting of civilian areas. We propped up a regime in Saigon, one of whose leaders was an admirer of Adolf Hitler, and who oversaw torture camps for anyone from leftists against the war to Buddhist monks. So this was really, really powerful for me. I decided to follow in the footsteps of the Berrigan brothers and Martin Luther King to try and do something to oppose Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. So in 1970, at the age of 18, I initiated the formation of a group called Christians for Peace, an interdenominational anti-war organisation which organised a series of protests, quite spectacular protests, against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, calling for the American and Australian troops to pull out. And this was the first time that all the different Christian groups had come together. There had been different Christian groups doing different things, but this brought them together, brought thousands of people together in protest and direct action against the war. Then, the year previous, at the age of 17, I realised I was gay. And from the first time that I had sex with a man, I felt emotionally and sexually fulfilled. Amazingly, given my astonishingly strict religious upbringing, which regarded homosexuality as a sin on a par with rape and murder, the proof of the pudding was in the eating, so to speak. Once I'd had gay sex and met someone I fell in love with, all that dogma went out the window. I thought to myself, how can something so sexually and emotionally fulfilling be wrong? between two consenting adults, how can it be wrong? The Bible has got it wrong. You know, most of the biblical prescriptions are there to protect people against harm. Neither I nor any of the gay people I knew were causing anyone any harm. In fact, they were bringing great joy to each other. So that positive experience overwhelmed all the years of anti-gay religious dogma that had been pummeled into me. And it helped by the fact that that first sexual experience blossomed into a great romance, and that person is still my best friend for life. It was quite amazing that I didn't feel any guilt, any shame, any doubt. As I said, I realized, how could something so positive and mutually fulfilling be wrong? So having instantly accepted my sexuality, I was determined to do my bit to help end the persecution of LGBT people. And I felt an even greater responsibility because I'd come out of the Christian tradition, which had been responsible for so much of that prejudice and oppression. So initially, I managed to reconcile my faith with my sexuality. Although the goodness and joy I experienced in a loving long-term relationship clearly contradicted biblical teaching. But it did again set me wondering, if the Bible had got it so wrong on same-sex love, what else has it got wrong? I asked myself questions like, and I'll just give you a few examples, if God made the world and the natural laws of physics, chemistry, and so on, according to his will and design, why does he intervene against his own natural laws by allegedly performing miracles that defy the natural laws that he devised? If God is love and infinitely good, why do religionists speak of God's wrath and fear him? And why does God condemn sinners to hell, which is supposedly a place of immense, cruel, barbaric torment and suffering? That hardly squares with the God of love. If God is perfect, wise, infallible, and master of the universe, why did his creations include people born with terrible deformities and genetic disorders? And why does his earthly firmament include the flaws and terrors of devastating tsunamis, earthquakes, and tornadoes? If God watches over us and protects us, why do sincere believers nevertheless have fear, including fear of death? And why do they have tragic accidents and die in wars and natural disasters? Doesn't sound like a protecting God at all. If the righteous are destined for heaven, why do they worry about whether they will get sick or die? And why do the followers of God mourn their passing? If God knows everything, why do the faithful have to inform him of their needs and bother him with their prayers? If God is just, why does he allow the good and godly to suffer? If God is fair, why does he punish people with genetic traits that are cause of great suffering? Why does he punish people by putting them in dysfunctional families, headed by bad parents, which predisposes them to doing wrong? If God made nature, why did he make it so harsh and cruel, based as it is on the survival of the fittest, where the weak and the vulnerable suffer and die, and where horrible natural diseases like Ebola and HIV kill decent, honourable people, including people of faith. If God is all-powerful, how is it possible to break his laws, resist his will, or cause him offense? If God is so great, why does he need to be worshipped and idolized? Why does he need to be protected against laws against blasphemy and apostasy? So these are some of the questions that I debated in my mind over and over. They didn't seem rational or consistent. By the time I turned 20, science and rationality finally triumphed over superstition and dogma. I didn't need or want God anymore. I felt intelligent, confident, informed, and mature enough to live without the security blanket of religion and its particular theological account of human life, its origins, and the universe. To me, people like John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, Charles Darwin, and others made more sense. So accordingly, I renounced religion and embraced reason, science, and ethics based on love and compassion. I concluded, we don't need God to tell us what is right and wrong. We humans are quite capable of figuring it out for ourselves. And that's not a statement of arrogance or superiority, it's just simply an assessment and a statement based upon human history, the evolution of ideas and knowledge. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is proof of this. It is not a God-given dogma or intolerance, but a fine example of high moral principles and values without religious diktat. It's what humanity has collectively decided should be the moral and guiding principles of life and government. So, following my abandonment of God and clerical dogmas, what are my religious or post-religious ethics? You can tell that I'm still a bit influenced by the past, because there are some things good in the religious canon, but they're not exclusive to religious tradition. So, the simple maxim, treat others as you would like them to treat you. That idea comes out of nearly all faiths and no faiths. It's not strictly speaking a religious philosophy, it is just plain common sense and human decency. The same goes for the parable of the Good Samaritan. We don't need religion to inform us that it's wrong to walk by and do nothing when other people are suffering. The motive of my human rights campaigning is very simple. It's a four-letter word, love. I love people, I love justice, I love peace, I love freedom, I love life. I don't like to see other people suffer. I think to myself, since I wouldn't want myself, my friends, or my family to suffer, why should I tolerate the suffering of other people, their family and friends? That principle of reciprocity is very, very, very simple. And I'm certain that if we all had love for the wider human family and a zero tolerance of suffering, most or many of the world's great injustices, like tyranny, hunger, and so on, would soon be solved. That's how I see it. And that's why I'm an atheist, a secularist, and a humanist. I'm very proud to support the work of the Humanist Association of Britain, the work of the National Secular Society, the Rationalist Association, and so on. They're all trying to shine a light on religious irrationalism, dogma, and privilege. And we certainly live in a society where, although religious privilege is not as great as it once was, it is still there. The head of state of this country must belong to the established state church, the Church of England. We've got 26 bishops who sit as of right in the House of Lords to speak and to vote. The only other country in the world where clerics sit as of right in the legislature is Iran. We have a third of our schools are faith schools, and growing thanks to successive governments. Now, some of those schools do great work, but a lot of them push a religious line as well. And it's very interesting now that finally last year the government has agreed to make relationship and sex education mandatory in every school, including faith schools. How will the circle be squared? Because the government has said that although this will be mandatory in faith schools, they will have a right to teach it within the context of their own religious tenets. And we know that many faith schools do exactly that already, and there's no indication they will change. For them, homosexuality, bisexuality, transgenderism, lesbianism, sex outside of marriage, full stop. It's all a sin. It's all wrong. And it's hard to imagine how they're going to teach relationship and sex education in an objective, unbiased way. The government hasn't yet said how that will happen. It says it will happen, but it hasn't said how. And when it's saying that they will have an opt-out, or they won't be able to not teach it, they'll have this opt-out of being able to teach it in accordance with their own tenets, that doesn't seem like the kind of positive, objective relationship and sex education that our children deserve. So we have made great progress in Britain in limiting religious privilege, but it definitely is not gone. I can remember, I used to be a member of the Labour Party, being so horrified when Tony Blair announced as Prime Minister that he was going to consult with religious leaders on every issue of social policy. That Labour would not enact any policy without consulting religious leaders. So they were regularly invited into Downing Street to be consulted about different aspects of government policy. Nobody else had that privilege. Women's organisations weren't invited to come in and be consulted about women's issues. LGBT ones weren't invited in. Black and ethnic minority organisations were not invited to Downing Street. Civil liberties and human rights groups were not invited, but religious ones were. And, ironically, David Cameron, when he became Prime Minister, rode back from that a bit. But still we do see an unhealthy deference. So the inquiry into Sharia courts in the UK had theologians full of it. It was stacked with theologians. They weren't all theologians, but how can you have an objective body looking at Sharia courts and other religious courts, din courts and so on? How can you have that if there is a substantive clerical religious input into that, when there was not a humanist input, a secular input, an atheist input? It just shows that the playing field is not level. The playing field is still skewed. So, just to conclude, I've made this journey, like many of you and many, many others. We all have a very distinctive personal trajectory. And sometimes it's very painful and long and drawn out. Sometimes it's relatively painless and brief. But I think as we become a more informed, educated society, where religious ideas are put under greater scrutiny, where religious institutions are put under greater scrutiny, particularly in the light of the successive child sex abuse scandals which have affected several of the major religions and denominations, we really do have to keep on challenging and questioning religious orthodoxy and privilege. And we have to ensure that our stories are told so that others who are about to embark on that journey, who are in the process, can feel comforted, sustained, and encouraged. But at the end of the day, for me, a different, better world is possible. And we don't need religion to make that happen. And it's often religion which is the obstacle to making that happen. All we need is love, and people willing to turn that love into political action for human freedom and liberation. So I'll finish with my motto: don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
Who would like to start off questioning? Peter at back.
Hi there. Can I just firstly say thank you so much, also Peter, for your excellent talk. It's wonderful just hearing the story from beginning to end. I wanted to ask you a question about your views on rights in general, and where they should be extended to, and where the limits of rights are, particularly non-human animals. So there's a group in the States at the moment with the Non-Human Rights Project.
Peter, can I interrupt you? Could you stand up?
Yeah,
Not everybody has perfect hearing. So.
I was orating very well. And they're trying to get the sort of very first animals granted with actual rights, as this being a kind of way to kind of break the barrier down between humans and non-human animals. You know, non-human animals are just as capable of suffering, and I agree with you exactly that the thing we want to be doing is trying to reduce suffering wherever possible. And you know, I wouldn't like to be trapped in a cage for my entire life and then killed and eaten. So I don't think that any creature that can suffer that's capable of not wanting that should have to go through with that. So I'm wondering, yeah, what are your views on the animal rights movement in general, and that as an overall goal? Thank you so much.
For those who don't know, I'm a long-time patron of Animal Aid, and work also with Peter and Captive Animals Protection Society, also as a patron. For me, human rights and animal rights are two sides of the same coin. They're both about ending suffering. Oppression and suffering, whatever the sentient creature may be, whether it be human or non-human, that is something fundamentally wrong. We should all abhor suffering, whether it's of our species or any other species. And this is really an extension of human rights, because when human rights was first conceived in its most crude and basic form, rights, millennia ago, in primitive times, rights only applied to the family, the immediate family or the clan. And then gradually over time they're extended to a wider tribal or kingdom. And then they extended to a nation, and then they eventually became universal, although initially predominant for men rather than for women. And much more recently for disabled people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. So the rights philosophy is in a constant state of evolution. And to me, rights for other species, for sentient non-human animals, is a fundamental and very important extension of that.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes. Can you tell us your name, please, Mark? Yeah, you.
Mark Elliott.
Mark, thank you.
It's interesting that you when you're starting from a strongly Christian background, do you think that, in a strange way, the degree of passion that you have now towards all the causes you have may have actually ironically started from the reaction against, or the background at least that you had from strongly held beliefs to which you then reacted? And do you think that, in a strange way, for people born without any religious background, that actually may be a disadvantage, in that there isn't a sort of set morality against which they can fight? So in other words, was there an advantage to you to get to where you are now, that you had at least some religious frame of reference?
Well, I wouldn't see it that my human rights work is a reaction to my very strict fundamentalist upbringing. I would see it as a departure from it, as an expansion, a branching out of some strands of it. But I've never consciously seen it as a reaction to that very strict fundamentalist upbringing.
Well, maybe not reaction to, but you'd already got a very strong moral background, presumably, even though, and as you say, your Martin Luther King was a great inspiration, and that was, you were seeing in a way, that's how the religion should be led. Isn't it perhaps true that any basic level religion is a man-made nonsense, to which, like the Zen masters would always say that you should reject the very religion you start with as the way to get to the true religion. And in the same way, perhaps you are fulfilling that within a Christian context.
Well, I think you can tell from my story that it wasn't like I suddenly decided I'm going to reject all that. It was a slow evolution of independent thinking and non-religious thinking. So you may be right. I mean, I think probably your question is a question that can only be answered by me sitting on a psychiatrist's couch. But at the end of the day, it's an interesting question, but as I said earlier on, I tend to judge things by results, by consequences, rather than how it all began. Interesting and important though that might be, and it can be instructive because it also, of course, can guide other people. But I just don't know, to be honest.
Valerie.
I'll stand up, please. My name is Valerie. I think it's possible to revolt against a belief sector and go the other way. But in my case, I think I just hate the wishy-washiness of organised religion, that they can say contradictory things and get away with it. I discovered that when I went to the Baptist church when I was 14, that the whole thrust of the sermon and the readings one week would be completely contradicted 3 weeks later. It would be turning the other cheek one week, and vengeance is mine, says the Lord, about a fortnight later. And I think one of the finishing moments for me when I left Christianity forever was when I had my first child. And my mother said to me, "Are you going to have her christened?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, well, it can't do any harm." I thought, that's why I'm not having my child christened.
Thank you, Valerie. Yes.
Peter, can I just ask you a personal question? I have long admired you as someone who was willing to put your own personal safety at risk in years when it wasn't safe to make a lot of the statements that you were making. And I just wanted to ask whether, because of the way in which the world has changed and the developments that you talked about have taken place, whether now you can live without fear of your safety being compromised in the way that it used to be.
Well, for those who don't know, in the 1980s and 90s, particularly but not exclusively due to my work on LGBT human rights, I was a national hate figure and a target for many, many, many violent attacks. I mean, I've had, over the last 40 years or so, I've had about, in excess of 300 violent physical assaults. Not threats or abuse, but actual physical violence. All the teeth in my mouth are reconstructed from being smashed by neo-Nazis, some Islamist extremists, homophobes. I've had well over 50 attacks upon my home, including bottles and bricks through the windows, 3 arson attempts, a bullet through the front door. It was very, very tough. It felt like living through a civil war, and outside of Northern Ireland, I don't think anybody in mainland Britain went through what I went through for those best part of 2 decades. But what sustained me was, first of all, some very strong, supportive friends, very high levels of security. Like even to this day, my flat has got all bars over all the windows, steel reinforced door, fire extinguishers in every room, a rope ladder to escape out the back. I haven't actually had a physical attack on my home for quite a few years. But who can tell? I mean, I'm doing some quite dangerous stuff from time to time in terms of challenging very powerful people. And there's been a succession of violent targeting. When I did the campaign against the 8 Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers who advocated killing LGBT people, when they wouldn't stop, I organised a global campaign to cancel their concerts. It cost them millions of pounds of lost ticket sales. And according to Metropolitan Police, a hit squad was sent to London to kill me, and I had to be under armed police protection for several months. Another time, after the attempted citizen's arrest of President Mugabe, again the police said they thought they had intelligence to suggest that someone had been sent to London to kill me in revenge for my bid to arrest Mugabe. Both those things didn't happen, fortunately. Then again, in the mid-1990s, the police discovered a plot by the neo-Nazi group Combat 18, where they targeted 10 people for assassination, mostly black and Asian rights campaigners, but I was also on the list. And they discovered them when the plot was quite far advanced and about to be executed. They had, I think, Uzi submachine guns, explosives. The police said if they managed to put that into practice, and they were on the verge of doing so, quite a few people would have been killed. So, yeah, I've lived with quite a lot, but perhaps this is me looking on the sunny side. I think to myself, well, compared to human rights defenders in Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, many parts of Africa and Asia, I've got off lightly. I know several of them have been murdered, or arrested, jailed, and tortured. So, putting it in perspective, I think, well, yeah, I have made some sacrifices, I have taken some risks, I've had some bad consequences, but nothing by comparison to some people I can think of who paid a far, far greater price. So that sort of perspective sort of sustains me and keeps me going.
Yes, could you stand up and yell, please, because we haven't got a roving mic.
Sally, I just wondered how your family reacted to your decision to leave their religion and to come over here, what their response was to you.
Yeah, their reaction was not very good. You could say they were not happy. Yeah, I mean, my father died in 2010, but my mother's still alive, and they're both very, very hardline. And my stepfather, who died about nearly 20 years ago, he was very hardline. So they were quite disappointed, is an understatement. And look at it from their perspective, they see, we care about this because we're going to live eternal life. We'll never see you again. It breaks my heart, my mother says, it breaks my heart to think that when you die or I die, we'll never see each other again. Whereas if you believed in God, we will have eternal life and we'll be together beyond this life. So if you really sincerely believe that, irrational though it may be, then that is a great comfort, and you can understand their sense of horror that I no longer share those beliefs.
Another question?
Or contribution.
Or contribution?
Or criticism.
Yes, young man there.
Hello, yeah, my name's Mark. I just wanted to ask what you thought was the general state of the humanist project at the moment, given some of the things you were talking about before in terms of growing numbers of faith schools and an increasing entrenchment of religious privilege, influence like the BBC, and no sign of any sort of move to get rid of bishops and house laws or anything. It sometimes feels a bit, not bleak, but it seems to be a paradox that as religion actually becomes, or Christianity becomes weaker, they actually seem to be getting more institutionally entrenched than they were 20, 30 years ago. So I wonder where you think we are at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of countervailing tendencies. On the one hand, the number of people who don't have a belief has gone up, but the number of people who have quite fundamentalist views of Christian, Judaist, Islamist and so on seems to be on the rise as well. It's still quite small, but it's bigger than it was, and that is where the growth is happening. So there are these two countervailing tendencies in terms of public opinion and belief. Likewise, there are some gains being made, but also some setbacks. You mentioned the rise in faith schools, and not only sort of the more Church of England and Catholic schools, but increasingly Jewish and Muslim schools as well. Likewise, when it comes to reforming the House of Lords, Labour for a while was proposing not to abolish the bishops, but to, give guaranteed places to other faith schools. So, yeah, it is challenging and it is tough. And again, all I can say is we need to take the long view. And in terms of historical perspective, compared to 50 years ago, let alone 100 or 200 years ago, we are much less faith-dominated society. And faith institutions have much less clarity and carriage in our society than they did all those years ago. So the overall trend is in the right direction, but we're certainly going through a period where there's a bit of a blip.
Great.
Yeah, can I just add to that question in the context of the international sphere?
Yeah.
Sorry, should I stand up?
Stand up.
Yeah, could I just extend that question out to the international sphere and ask what your thoughts are? Because it almost feels to me, as an international relations scholar, that humanism or secularism is, under attack in many, many countries, particularly Muslim countries. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that issue.
Yeah, it's interesting that there are, on the LGBT issue, a whole number of countries that have swung into quite reverse attitudes and a very substantial increase in repression. Like Indonesia has had no great history of anti-LGBT witch hunts, but in the last few years, and particularly the last 6 months, there's been a huge escalation. Raids on gay venues, the arrest of gay individuals, the rise of Islamist extremist groups that openly parade calling for homosexuality to be made illegal. And in fact, there's a bill coming before the Indonesian parliament to outlaw homosexuality, for the first time ever. Also demands in Malaysia, again Islamist inspired, for the re-education and curing of homosexuality. Ethiopia, there's been no history of anti-LGBT movements there, but the rise of evangelical Christianity plus some political opportunism has led to a big witch hunt in Ethiopia. Lots of people being arrested and jailed. So there's lots of countervailing tendencies and lots of worrying signs. You've probably heard about the murder of 2 prominent gay activists in Bangladesh about a year or so ago. And that is allied to the murder of secularists, atheists and humanists in that country, and a rising persecution of Christians as well. So I think a lot of these issues are really related. In Pakistan, the same people who are targeting LGBT people or women who dress immodestly, or Shia Muslims, because they're predominantly Sunni, Shia Muslims, Ahmadis, Sikhs, Christians, it's all the same group of people. An Islamist-inspired, a fundamentalist Islamist-inspired witch hunt against faith and sexual and gender minorities. And to me it points to the need and importance of working together. Instead of seeing all these issues separate and unrelated, we need to recognise that when humanists are attacked and murdered in Pakistan, it's the same people who are killing Christians, LGBT people and so on, and all those groups need to work together. But as you will know, some of the very brave people who have stood out against the extremists have been murdered. Lawyers and judges. The case of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman who has been basically framed or trumped up charges of insulting Islam. Basically, it's paid back in a community dispute. She was sentenced to death for blasphemy in Pakistan. I think she's been in prison for about 7 years now. She's had appeals, but every time the appeal comes up, the judges call sick because they're terrified that if they do go into the court and give ground to appeal, they and their families will be killed. And it's the same with public figures in Pakistan who've spoken out for free thought, for the right to be an atheist or a humanist. They're targeted. And we have to find a way of bringing all these groups together. I actually work quite closely with the British Pakistani Christian Association, many of whose members are quite evangelical, but through my involvement as an openly gay man supporting their cause, I've noticed quite a lot of attitude change in some of those people. And the main coordinator of the group had confided to me recently that he had a gay brother and he was fine about it, and he welcomed the support. And he actually brought a delegation from the British Pakistani Christian Association to a vigil I organised against the persecution of LGBT people in Russia at the time when the new law was introduced, the new anti-gay law was introduced in 2013. So I think it shows the importance of collaboration and working together, because united we are stronger.
Elaine.
I'm Elaine. Just a comment, Peter. A 5-year-old said to her mother, "Mummy, how does God understand every language in the world when everybody's praying? And how can he answer everybody's prayers together?" I thought that was quite observant for a 5-year-old.
Point taken.
Good one. Out of the mouths of babes. Any more questions? Sophie.
What makes you feel the most hopeful regarding secularism and humanism today?
If
What?
you didn't hear that, it was what makes Peter feel the most hopeful about humanism and secularism.
Well, at times when I hear some of the stories coming out of Iran or Saudi Arabia, I actually feel quite depressed and very unhopeful. But I take the long view. The arc of human history, Martin Luther King said, bends towards justice. And I think that ultimately that is the way humanity is going, towards a more secular humanist direction. And that although there is this revival of fundamentalism in certain countries, and it's quite threatening, menacing and dangerous, it is a blip. It is I think, a temporary thing. And as we all know, history isn't a straight line from reaction to progress, from the dark ages to light. It's a snakes and ladders. It's up and down and backwards and forwards. You make some gains and then you step back and you make further gains. But overall, gains are being made. And I think that as more and more people become educated, the amazing influence of social media and the World Wide Web, it is bringing alternative ideas to societies where they've been very closed and censored. I'm constantly amazed in very traditional societies how, despite the official doctrine and dogma, the actual practice of people is often very different. Just to give you an example, some years ago, you may recall that the Iranian president then, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was asked about homosexuality and said, "Oh, there are no homosexuals in Iran," to which everybody laughed. Then a couple of years later, the Iranian parliament set up a commission of inquiry to look at youth culture, thinking we must understand youth culture in order to know how to keep them on a narrow, straight Islamist path. So we must investigate what they're thinking and what they're doing to find out what's going wrong and what's going right. And when things are going wrong, we need to find out ways to correct them. So very foolishly, they asked a question about homosexuality, expecting they would get like 0.001%. This is a question to high school, college and university students. So in the age range 16, I think, to 24. They were gobsmacked that in response to the question, "Have you ever had a same-sex relationship?" 17% of Iranian youth in that demographic said yes, even though there's the death penalty. I mean, the questionnaires were all anonymous. I don't think any of them would have said that if they had to sign their name and give their address or anything, but 17%. So despite the religious dogma and the state repression, quite clearly, under the influence of just the culture and the outside world through the internet, Iranian young people are behaving very differently from what their leaders expect and want. And that gives me hope. It gives me hope that, you can have a dogmatic clerical tyranny like in Tehran, and still people will find ways around it and rebel against it.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Any more? Peter again here.
Hi, apologies asking for a second time. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts generally on a bit of a kind of political quandary. Ordinarily, one would hope that the champions of human rights would be kind of generally progressive left-wing people. There tends to be a bit of an issue on the left at the moment with people being unwilling to directly criticize Islam because they're sort of accurately recognizing that Muslims are often the targets of oppression. That's a real thing. But it's often getting exchanged in a strange way with fears of being called a racist. And even though, of course, Islam is a universal religion, anyone of any race could be a Muslim. But it's kind of created, in my view, a sort of strange vacuum where ordinarily you would want to have a huge unified response to the ills of kind of Islamic fundamentalist groups worldwide. There just seems to be a kind of awkward silence as people just kind of shuffle out of the room backwards. Just your general views on that situation.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there is incredible double standards and inconsistencies by many, if not most people, on the left liberal spectrum of opinion. They would argue, as you suggest, that we mustn't do anything that fuels the flames of Islamophobia. That by highlighting these abuses, you're playing into an anti-Islam, anti-Muslim narrative, which will lead to bad consequences for Muslim people in this country and around the world. Now, up to a point, I can sympathize with that. The problem is, if left and progressive people don't take a stand against Islamist extremism, they leave the door open to the far right, who will make generalized attacks upon all Muslim people. And that's exactly what is happening. The reason why the BNP and the EDR in this country, and Alternative for Germany Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, are making progress is precisely because the left and liberal spectrum of opinion has abdicated and absented themselves from the public debate. I think it's really, really important that we, first of all, stand in solidarity with those progressive Muslim people who are trying to change things. I don't know if any of you are familiar with is it Imam of Peace or Imam for Peace? That's the hashtag, the Twitter @sign. He does some great things. He's I think Canadian, maybe, I'm not sure, but Imam, and he takes a very unorthodox view about Islam. He's very critical of traditional Islam, and believes that Islam has no role to play in politics. So he's against political Islam, Islamist extremism, not just in terms of people throwing bombs, but people trying to impose Islam on others, and people demanding that the law reflect Islamic values. There's lots and lots of people like that. Some do it very privately because they fear repercussions, like there are imams in this country who will positively and supportively counsel LGBT Muslims and reassure them it's okay to be gay and Muslim, which is a very radical, daring thing to do, but not one of them is willing to be public because they fear the consequence. They fear retribution by their own community. But I think, even if you are anti-religious, it's important to support reformers within religion if they are trying to progress from extremism and fundamentalism to something more liberal, because that's the first step towards going beyond religion. In terms of situation in this country, I'm sure you're all familiar with the attempts to ban the Iranian communist feminist Maryam Namazi from speaking at universities on the grounds that she is anti-Islam. Well, she is critical of Islam, sure. She's an atheist and a secularist and a humanist. But she defends Muslim people against discrimination and prejudice and hate crime. And she is very, very much involved in campaigns against the BNP, but as it was, the EDL, Britain First, and all the other right-wing extremist organisations. And the idea that she should be banned and scapegoated and vilified and misrepresented as someone as being anti-Muslim is profoundly twisted. She is far from those things. And again, it's because some of these students at universities think that if you're critical of Islam, which is an idea, it's not a race or a person, Islam is an idea, and all ideas should be open to critical, skeptical thought, including humanism, atheism, and secularism, just as much as religion. What is profoundly disturbing is that in some of these cases, some of these critics of Islamist extremism, including myself, have been denounced by feminist societies and LGBT societies. Not just Islamist societies at universities, but feminist and LGBT ones. It beggars belief how a feminist society can support an Islamist society at a university that believes that men and women must be segregated by force and sit separately. That believes that women must wear the hijab. There's no choice about it. They must wear the hijab. How can any feminist support that? You've seen the worldwide women's marches, and quite a strong narrative within that is defense of the hijab. Now, I don't believe that anybody should either be compelled to wear or not to wear the hijab, just like I don't think anybody should be compelled or not compelled to wear their baseball hat back to front. It's a personal preference, which may be religious or fashion or whatever. But what I do object to is somehow thinking or suggesting that the hijab is not a symbol of women's oppression. It's just like foot binding in ancient China, or the many other female genital mutilation. It isn't as severe as that. So obviously there's no comparison between wearing a hijab and wearing female. There's no comparison between wearing a hijab and female genital mutilation. But they both come from the same place that believes that women are different and should be subjected to different rules. I always say, if the hijab is so important, why don't Muslim men wear it? The hijab is a symbol of oppression. Now, some Muslim women choose to wear it. It is their choice, and I'll defend their choice. I won't say they shouldn't be allowed to wear it. But we know that even in this country, a lot of Muslim women are pressured by their families, their communities, and their mosques to wear it. There is the expectation, the pressure to wear it. And I think that's profoundly wrong. And what is astonishing, and truly astonishing, is that during the women's marches around the world just a few weeks ago, hardly any of them expressed any solidarity with women in Iran who are throwing off the hijab, saying we should not be forced to wear this garment, which is a symbol of sexist, patriarchal privilege. It represents the tyranny of this regime against women. Hardly anybody on those marches supported those brave, heroic women, many of whom were arrested and abused in police detention. Now, that just shows how right you are to point out the hypocrisy and the double standards. And how can the left and how can liberal people have credibility if they are such blinding double standards? They would not take the same stand towards Christians, for example. There's no comparative. The idea that you can satirize Christianity, that you can criticize Christianity, has never been contested by people on the left in progressive opinion, at least not for centuries. But the moment you try and make those same comparable points about Islam, you get branded anti-Muslim. There is a very important distinction. Islam is an idea, like all ideas, that should be open to scrutiny and criticism. Muslims are people. and discrimination and prejudice against people is always wrong. Very easy, very simple. Some people don't get it.
One more, and I can Malcolm at the back, can you project?
On that last point, Peter, one of the main people in journalism, as you will know, has been harping on for many, many issues of the Observer about failure, and to whom the cowardice there on issues like that is Nick Cohen, who you may be aware, but almost a colleague of, you may be aware, takes that particular stand, which I follow him very strongly in.
Yes, I know Nick very well, and I think he's written a lot of
Do you
very...
agree that he quite rightly makes some very important points on that score?
Which points are you referring to? Sorry.
The failure of the left with regard to seeing, the suppression of Muslim issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that Christianity never did it or Judaism never did it.
No.
All faiths have had misogyny and patriarchy embedded in them.
Very much so.
But right now, the most vocal and extreme forms of that misogyny are coming out of certain strands of Islam, which is not to blame all Muslim people. I've got Muslim feminist friends, Muslim gay friends, Muslim left-wing and liberal friends. They are absolutely rock solid on free speech and the right to protest, the right to criticize their faith. No argument with them at all. But they are a minority. They are a minority, an often unheard minority. And what I'm saying is, we need to hear them and need to support them and need to give them a platform so that they can speak out, to show that, unlike the way in which many left and liberal people seem to think, Muslim people are not a homogenous bloc. The Muslim Council of Britain does not speak for all Muslim people, although it claims to. There are many different strands of Muslim opinion, as there is of left-wing opinion, Christian opinion, and so on. And not all those voices are as reactionary as the ones that we are often given to hear. That is, you will find, less so now than 10 or 15 years ago, but so often you would find that quite reactionary, right-wing, misogynistic, homophobic Muslims were given a platform, whereas the liberal, progressive Muslims weren't. I can remember fighting for years to try and get articles in The Guardian, this was like 10 or 15 years ago, by liberal, progressive Muslims. And The Guardian, under the then comment editor, just wouldn't allow it. He would give platforms to all kinds of Islamist apologists, but not to other Muslims who are challenging that. So, for example, I did a little bit of work helping to get refugee status in this country for Sheikh Qakwani of Iran, the son of one of the most esteemed theologians in Shia Islam, whose father was probably murdered by the Islamist regime because he spoke out in favour of a liberal progressive Islam, and in particular rejected political Islam. He was a very, very strong critic of political Islam and said there had to be a reconciliation between Islam, democracy and human rights. And his son carried on that work, but eventually, when it looked like he too was going to be murdered, he fled, first I think to Qatar, and then he came to Britain. And he wrote a fantastic piece. Well, he doesn't speak English, or didn't speak English at the time. He wrote a terrific piece in Arabic, which was then translated, which made the same point as his father, that Islam is compatible with democracy and human rights and women's rights, or should be. I tried to get that published in The Guardian several times. Every time they said no. You would have thought from a news value point of view, from someone of such esteemed clerical heritage as this man, you would have thought they would have grabbed it, but they didn't. Yes. And eventually he did deliver it, I think, to a committee of the House of Commons. But it got, shockingly, despite my best efforts and the efforts of others, it got virtually no publicity whatsoever. So it's about, there are certain people in our society who want to play the narrative that all Muslims are the same, they're all intolerant and bigoted, and not recognise that some people within Islam are really trying to change things.
I'm afraid we really have got to wind up. I'm sure that you all still got lots of questions in your mind, but I'm aware that Peter's got to get off and get a train, and some of you may have to as well. But can I say once again, thank you so much, Peter. That was really, really interesting. And as always, we truly admire your passion and your dedication to the defence of human rights. So can we just give Peter a